Okay, so it looks like we've got a good chunk of people. Still got some more coming on, but I'll start by getting us introduced. So first of all, thank you again for everyone for joining us this morning. This is our first Young Scholar webinar in this fall period. I thought we had some really great speakers in the spring, and we're looking forward to another great set of speakers. So I'll just start off and introduce our speaker today. So today we're going to welcome Ghassane. I'll be moderating. Mike Ghassane is going to present his paper with Jocelyn Roman called The Distributional Cost of Net Zero, a Heterogeneous Agent Perspective. Ghassane is an assistant professor of economics at IE University and IE Business School. He's also an associate fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science, King's College Business School, and Paris Science and Letters. His research explores linkages between macroeconomic theory and heterogeneity, asset pricing theory, climate change, and the distributional impacts of both environmental externalities and policy. And I personally enjoy hearing his presentations and seeing his research, so I'm excited to hear him today. Before we do get started and turn the time over to him, we are going to do as we always have done and introduce or invite everyone to participate in a brief 1-minute survey. So Samia, who's helping us take care of the webinar this morning, is going to make that available for everyone. If you could just take 1 minute to answer that, we'll wait for responses to come in, and then we will turn the time over. So I'll give 1 minute for that. Okay, looks like we've had about a minute there. So I'll just read the question and get us sort of introduced before we're going. So the poll question was, climate mitigation policies aimed at achieving net zero by 2050, can they have adverse distributional effects mostly? The responses are that in the short term or medium period, they think that potentially could be the case, and in the long run, not so much. And then the second question was, because of carbon pricing inflation, do we think this is lower during the transition period, higher in the long run, or both of the above? And actually split between the two single options, and most people are saying both of the above. So I think sort of this is a good suggestion that you'll have some nice, interesting context to give us and some thoughts. So I will turn the time over to you, Ghassane, and you'll have about 50 minutes or so. And just so everybody knows, we will have a chunk about 10 minutes of time at the end or so for Q&A. So please put your questions as you go, and we'll try and get those through. If they're clarification questions, we'll try and maybe get some of those answered. But if not, we'll have a good chunk of time at the end to answer Q&A. So I will turn the floor over to you, Ghassane. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks a lot, Mike, for providing this opportunity and for everyone to be here today. I'm really happy to share with you a little bit of my research. And please interrupt me at any point if the sound doesn't work very well, but I'll try to really keep it close to my mouth so that way it works quite nicely. Let me put this on the big screen. So, okay. 1 sec. There we go. So it should be all good for now. Yep. So perfect. So as Mike said, so this is joint work with Ghassane Roman, and it's the distributional cost of the net zero heterogeneous agent perspective. What I would like to start with is just, this is basically for Ghassane, because Ghassane is at the European Commission, the Joint Research Center. So just sort of like the usual disclaimer that applies for him. But the main question that we're really interested in and we're trying to answer here is that what are the distributional impacts of implementing a net zero policy that aims at carbon neutrality by 2050 in the context of the US. Now, we could have done the exact same exercise for the EU. The only difference is we did it for the US because we had some data on the California cap and trade market. So that way we were able to have some transition dynamics that are based on some historical data and empirical facts. But same exercise could be done for Europe for that matter. It just to basically clarify why we did it for the context of the US. Now, the main motivation, as we probably, and this is probably less relevant for the audience that we have here today, but we're trying to reach a net zero policy by 2050, whereby we're trying to keep temperature below specific levels, say 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius. Now, the idea is to have emissions reaching zero level by 2050, or even like a net zero level by 2050. This cap trajectory, whether it's linear or non-linear, this is just for like the sake of representation, would require us to move towards some sort of like carbon pricing. And this is the solution that have been already broadcasted by most of public economics and economists for a long time now. And this is sort of almost like a heat map that just shows us a little bit what's going on around the world with respect to carbon pricing. So in blue, this is all what has been already put in place. We could already see the EU ETS in different regions, the UK and Europe, same for California, and all the other places around the world. We're kind of thinking about that. Try to keep the mic close. Okay, so make sure to do that, or I can try to do something. So my apologies. I'll try just to switch it to maybe. And hopefully, I don't know if this is making it better, but I hope it's okay. Okay, let me see. This might be the best way. So hopefully this is probably slightly improved the case. Is it the case? Okay, perfect. So yeah, so as I was basically saying, there's this sort of like heat map just showing us what's going around the world with respect to carbon pricing. So a lot of places are thinking about it, and what seems to be gaining momentum is the cap and trade market. And essentially, between going for a carbon tax or for a cap and trade market, the cap and trade just sets the sort of trajectory whereby we're trying to reduce emissions following a specific timeline. And the one I'm showing over here is the one for the California cap and trade, whereby emissions will reach some neutrality by 2045, which is slightly faster than what we've have all sort of around the world, which is the 2050 timeline and target. Now, by trying to reach carbon neutrality by a specific timeline, this would trigger some increase and spikes in carbon pricing. And since 2020, what we see at the end of the period over here is that carbon pricing is starting to crank up. Now, as the cap is tightening toward the net zero policy, we could expect that this sort of like increase in carbon prices will keep going on unless we have some amazing technology in the next foreseeable future. We could think about carbon. We could think about fusion that would curve down that carbon pricing. It is likely that carbon price will go up. So the only potential possibility is having this innovative technology that would allow us to get it for much cheaper. Now, as carbon pricing could be expected to go up, and this is not just the case of Europe or any other place around the world, we can see that there is a trend, and this is quite substantial and consequent pretty much everywhere. That could lead to substantial distributional macroeconomic costs. This macroeconomic distributional costs that would follow up this increase in carbon pricing, and we could already see that in terms of the energy prices and the crisis we had over the past year. And even beyond, would raise a lot of questions about the political feasibility. And we can remember what happened in the case of the Yellow Vest, the social upheaval that happened both in France and also different parts of the world. And I'm showing the case of Chile and France here, but we also have it in places around Canada and in other places around the world, following the introduction, or at least the proposition of having a carbon price, where the distributional impacts could just impede the whole feasibility of a net zero policy. So now, my question that we're trying to answer in this paper have very tight links to political feasibility and the political economy, but I'm not going to claim any political economy modeling or framework to speak directly to that. But we do speak quite nicely to such questions, specifically through the distributional impacts that we are trying to look through our framework and our question. So where we stand today is there is a need for an aggressive environmental policy to meet the climate goals. That's one thing. That could lead to substantial costs, both for firms and households, that could be associated to these high prices of carbon. And finally, that could also lead to a lot of impact, both on the income and wealth distribution, given that this carbon pricing could have some regressive impact in the overall. So in order to be able to answer this kind of question, we require a framework that have three ingredients. So the first one, and almost the most natural one, would be heterogeneity. We can't think about distributional impact unless we have some heterogeneity, specifically in the case of and in the context of the households. So that's going to be the first thing. The second thing, we have to think about transition dynamics. We can't just think about a static world. What is the state of the world today? What is the state of the world in 2050 and 2100? So we can't think of it just in terms of steady states, but we will require these transition dynamics, and we would need some kind of equilibrium effect that would be going through prices. And that's going to be very important and would play a key role in explaining potentially what could be happening over the transition to a net zero policy. So the objective of the paper and the main result, I will just tell you a little bit about that before probably diving in and showing you exactly how we are thinking about the modeling perspective, are the following. So the first, we're trying to communicate and also contribute to two types of literature, so an empirical one and a theoretical one. Now, the bulk and the heart of the paper is very theoretical, so it's really about the modeling and about the transition period and how we are thinking about that. But in order to make sure that the model is grounded in real empirical facts, we use the California cap and trade market and data on the California cap and trade in order to make sure that our model responses to just carbon shocks are well-grounded and well-calibrated based on what we've observed in the case of the California cap and trade market. Now, it's the major one in the US, and it's the one that we base our analysis on, simply to make sure that our macro framework, our heterogeneous agent macro framework, kind of represents and captures stylized facts that we already see in the empirical data. So that's where the empirical part is really here present for. And then we go on and we build a macro framework that encompasses both heterogeneity and climate dynamics in order to study this medium long-run transition toward net zero and beyond. Now, if anything I would like you probably to take from this talk is this slide. So that's why I put it in bulk and probably used a little bit of colors that are almost speaking to themselves. So the first part is a net zero policy, and the word necessary here means it's welfare enhancing, meaning that going toward a net zero policy that aims at carbon neutrality by 2050 is welfare enhancing. We quantify that to be about 0.5% in terms of welfare gains in consumption equivalents. As an order of magnitude, if this is not something that is very intuitive and speaking to you, this is 50 times higher than the Lucas finding of the business cycle cost of the business cycle costs in terms of welfare in consumption equivalents. So that's the first part, which means, okay, well, perfect. If net zero policy is welfare enhancing and it does have a substantial impact on welfare that is positive, then we should just stop there. But the caveat is what happens during the transition. But before moving there, the big intuition behind is that as we go toward a net zero policy, we're able to make sure that temperature does not go beyond a specific level, say 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. By keeping temperature below that level, we're able to curb down all the potential damages that we get from rising temperature, and therefore we avoid all those productivity losses and the output losses. And therefore, that's a welfare enhancing type of policy in the long run. But the caveat, as I mentioned, is what happens over the transition period, meaning between today and 2050. As the government imposes a cap policy by which emissions would be reduced and get to zero by 2050, firms will have to engage now in abatement innovation and abatement investment, meaning that they will have to reallocate resources traditionally, and the ones that we'll be using will be capital and labor. Therefore, the wages, which are the two main things that we'll have in the economy, both wages and rates of returns will be dropped, will decrease over the transition as firms now are engaging in higher abatement investment. Household, they perfectly foresee that the government will go for a net zero, and therefore firms will be reallocating resources in the economy, so they would like to hedge against this drop in wages and rates of returns. Therefore, they would like to borrow from the future. But the fact that they're financially constrained, there is a borrowing constraint in our framework, make it that households, they cannot borrow to infinity, and they start accumulating toward the borrowing constraint. We quantify that to be 6 to 10% of households that were not initially financially constrained become so during the peak of the transition by around 45. And this is something I'll be able to share with you later on in one of our simulations. But that's the big message, and that's the big finding of the paper. Now, this is just said slightly differently in a full sentence. That's my first bullet point here. But how can we fix these sort of distributional impacts, at least these effects that we have over the transition, and how can we avoid them? We show that, and we find that income-based redistribution is one of the most effective tools to make sure that we eliminate some of these negative impacts that we have on welfare and on consumption. And it's not going to eliminate all of them, but it would be able to smooth a big part of these distributional impacts over the transition. So it's a tool to be considered. And finally, we also look at what could be happening with respect to inflation. And I think that's one of the questions that we had on the poll earlier on, and especially also what would be the role of green innovation. So we kind of explore them on the side to see how would the whole result stand and change following these two. And we find that there will be some high inflationary pressures over the transition, but all these impacts could be eased by some green innovation processes if we do go and invest on them and we model it through learning by doing. So those are the main takeaways of what we have. Now, moving from these main takeaways, let me probably share my favorite slide. This is like basically what I really like the most. It just sets the tone, what we really do versus what we don't. So in this paper, we focus on the macroeconomic and distributional costs via the household side. This is really where the heterogeneity is present, and we do not model heterogeneous damages, whereby some people could be impacted more by, say, different climate damages, probably the high frequency of hurricanes and so on. So we do not have that specific part in this specific framework and in this specific paper, although we do recognize that it's a very interesting avenue of research. We focus on the net zero cap trajectory and trajectories and do not look at the social cost of carbon, meaning we're not looking at what is the social cost of carbon, because there is no guarantee that a social cost of carbon on first best policy would get us to a net zero policy by 2050. But we explore the different type of trajectories that would lead us to a net zero policy by 2050, and we find which one could be the most welfare enhancing. We do not compare or assess the efficiency of cap versus tax policies. We consider them to be isomorphic, as we do not have aggregate uncertainty in our specific framework. And finally, we consider the US to be a closed economy. This is rather almost a standard assumption in the macro frameworks, but it just avoids looking at the rest of the world separately. So the rest of the world is also following the same type of policy. The idea behind is that there is no free riding and everybody is cooperating. Same, I think, could be very interesting as well to look at an open economy where the rest of the world would not necessarily do exactly the same thing. Now, in terms of the literature, we are contributing to two types of the empirical one, whereby for the carbon price and inequality, the main contribution of our paper is that we're looking at the California market and using a novel instrument in order to be able to retrieve those carbon price shocks. So there's one paper, probably the closest one will be Diego Kenzig's paper, and that looks at the EU ETS, but in our case, we look at the California cap and trade market, and we use a slightly different instrument than the new shocks. But in order to identify those shocks that could peak happening in the economy, specifically in the context of the cap and trade market in California, we use a centrometric instrument, which is in essence capturing all the sentiment that we have about climate change in the US between 2003 and 2018 for the time period that we look at. And we use it to extract the carbon price shocks and use it as an instrumental variable. So that's what we bring toward the literature, and this is the literature we also speak to closely when we're looking at our empirical exercises. But as I said, the really heart of the paper is the theoretical part, and in this case, we have a big literature on the distributional macro that has been growing since the end of the 90s, and it's exploding at this exact moment with a lot of new contributions and tools. And to that, what we do is we bring the climate question. Most of these macro finance models that look at heterogeneity do not look at the climate perspective or climate dynamics, and this is what we're trying to contribute to. Now, there has been a work that has looked at the distributional macro and climate in sort of macro perspectives, but the main difference probably with respect to that, and I think the work of probably Steffi or Valentina Bosetti, Steffi Fried or Valentina Bosetti are the closest in that regard, is that we bring a full-fledged macroclimate model with heterogeneous agents, and we include to that long-run transitions. That would be very important. So we go beyond just the steady state, and we also try to see how the inflation dynamics could be incorporated in such a framework. So that's the main addition and the contribution with respect to such literature and the work that has been already conducted. Now, let me give you a snapshot, probably before moving toward all the kind of like part by part, exactly how we want things. But this is just a snapshot that tells you exactly how we're thinking about it. So our households are modeled a la Ashdo and all, whereby they're heterogeneous, both in terms of income and wealth. So we have some income processes that would allow us to generate a wealth distribution that replicates the one that we observe in the US. Then our households, they provide labor and capital for wages they get from firms and rentals of capital and profits. Now, they lend it to what we call both intermediate firms and energy firms. The final firm is just an aggregation of both our intermediate and energy firms. Our intermediate firms is something we could consider almost as non-energy firms. In essence, they would be using energy inputs from energy producing firms, and both our energy firms and our intermediate firms will be emitting CO2 emissions. This is what we call the E upscript Y, E upscript E. And our intermediate firms would be subject to some climate damages. Now, we could have almost put climate damages on both type of firms, but the idea at the end is that they just need to aggregate one, so we put it on the intermediate firms. And this is the environmental externality that we model and matches on. By doing so, now firms, whenever they produce, they will be emitting CO2 in the atmosphere. The government will need to intervene, and this is the whole climate externality classic intervention of the government, would intervene by either setting a cap or a carbon tax. That's the TAP. In our framework, they're isomorphic. So by either setting the cap or the tax, the government would be able to curve down and limit those CO2 emissions, therefore forcing firms to engage in some abatement, innovation, or investment. And we have some monetary policy that would also try to make sure that we get the right level of inflation, so inflation targeting through a Taylor rule, and the public authorities will use those carbon revenue as transfers T back to the household, and will show that's going to play a major role, especially in supporting these distributional impacts over the transition. Now we move to the full model. If there is some clarification question, please be happy to do that. I can keep an eye on the chat. Now, from the environmental externality perspective, what we have over here is that we're modeling it a la Matthews and all, whereby the cumulative stock of emission, XT, the change in cumulative stock of emission is just the emission flow today in the US, so that's ET, plus the rest of the world's emissions. And the emissions that we have in the US, the flow of emissions we have in the US will be the sum of all our non-energy firms, which is E upscript Y, and the energy firms E upscript E. So that's the sum of all the firms that we have, which that comes to unit. Temperature, therefore, will just increase following the law of motion, where it's impacted by, so the change of temperature is impacted by the cumulative stock and the previous temperature, where phi 1 and phi 2 are the responses of temperature to the cumulative emissions that we calibrate following matches and all science paper. Our economy will become comprised of two sectors, as I said. So what we call the energy sector, so that's E upscript N, and our intermediate sector Y, or in other words, the non-energy sector. So the energy sector is just a Cobb-Douglas function using both capital and labor, and some exogenous technology that would also follow a trend, as we will be looking at long-run transition. So there will be some growth rate that would be exogenous in this case. Our intermediate firms would be subject to damages, and they will be using also energy as an input in this specific case. Now, in this case, we're showing it as a Cobb-Douglas function in an extension that we have. Now we're doing it through a CES function. The results are just higher in terms of magnitude. So what I will be sharing with you today is almost like a lower bound in terms of distributional impacts that we can encounter over the transition. Now, moving to emissions, so E upscript E and E upscript Y that we see in these two equations, 6 and 7, those are just CO2 emissions. So our CO2 emissions are just a fraction of total production, E upscript N, being the production of energy. And same for the non-energy sector, the emissions from non-energy sectors are just a fraction of the total production of the non-energy sector. They will be subject to some improvement, and this is what I would call the intensity, the CO2 intensity. We calibrate it to be the level of the intensity of CO2 from energy and non-energy sectors in the US today. And we allow for a trend which captures the improvements that we see in the economy following processes and how we're able to produce in a more efficient way. But there also will be allowed, the firms will be allowed to invest in some abatements. And therefore, whenever the government is putting an environmental policy, mu would be different than zero, meaning firms would engage in some abatement that would allow them to reduce CO2 emissions. This investment or this cost function of abatement, we take it from Nordhaus, and we do recognize that it's subject to a lot of criticism, especially with respect to the calibration and from where we get that. But we feel that we do run a lot of sensitivity analysis and uncertainty over the parameters to get a good picture of what could be potentially the distribution cost. So we allow for a lot of uncertainty over the parameterization. But in essence, it just captures that the last unit of emission will be very expensive to abate. So it's a convex function where theta 2 will be higher than 2. Now, as it will be standard in any sort of RBC or new Keynesian model, the firms will try to maximize their profits subject to the cost that they will have to put in place. So energy firms will maximize the energy production subject to the labor force, the wage that they need to pay the labor force, the capital investment, and the two new terms which I put in red that would inherently come from the fact that the government is imposing an environmental policy. So the first term will be the abatement cost investment, and the second term will be the carbon price. And in the optimality condition, what we have is that the carbon price, the tau, would be equal to that marginal abatement cost, the standard result that we would have in microeconomics. Same for the non-energy firms. They would maximize profit subject to the wages they pay to the labor force, the investment in capital they have, the energy prices they would have to pay, and the abatement cost and carbon price they have to pay to the government or the public authority in this specific case. Now, in the case of flexible prices, because we also have inflation dynamics, so we extend our model to having some new Keynesian structure whereby we're able to have some sort of pricing dynamics. Now, in the first case, we could almost think about it as the marginal cost is fixed. In most of the RBC models, we normalize that to 1. In this case, we keep it non-equal to 1 just to keep a good sort of like parallel to the case where we have the new Keynesian story. Now, why is it very important and interesting to have this new Keynesian story? It's because the marginal cost when we go through this long-run environmental policy, we see that the marginal cost is not just the shadow cost of the firms. So in a standard RBC where there is no environmental policy, the marginal cost will be just equal to the firm's input shadow cost. But once we engage on a net zero trajectory where we have environmental policy, two extra terms will add to the marginal cost, making it a higher over the transition, which is the abatement investment and emission intensity carbon tax. So the inflationary pressures could be at play over the transition. And it's something important to not necessarily lose track of. But for most of what I will be showing you today, I won't show the part of like the inflation dynamics, but it's something that we also speak on the paper, but we will keep it outside just to keep the analysis quite like straightforward today. Household will maximize their lifetime utility, subject to basically either making decisions between working or saving in the capital, in the assets we have 18-year transfers that they will get from the government. And as I said, our households are heterogeneous, which means we have different type of productivities, and this is what we call Z1 and Z2, meaning in a simple case, we have two type of productive household, low productive household, a very high productive household, or if we can say it differently, low income and high income household. And the fact that there will be some Markov switching probability between these two states will generate one distribution. Same, we're extending it in a new version of my paper to having a continuum of productivities here. So not restricting the analysis just to two type of income households and a multitude of wealth distribution, but to basically have a joint distribution of income and wealth. The results will remain pretty much the same. The public authority sets an emission cap, and this is where the government intervention will be very important. So either we will set a carbon cap that would allow us to get emissions to exactly the level that we wish by the timeline that we would like, following a trajectory that we deem interesting. So we will explore different type of trajectories and see which one could be the most optimal from the perspective of a 2050 emission reduction and net zero cap. And those carbon revenue will be used as transfer back to the households. This is just the monetary authority. They will be setting their nominal interest rate following the Taylor rule, reacting both to inflation gap and output gap. And finally, that's in equation 18, that's just the Fisher equation that links the nominal to inflation. Now, as I said, the main channels through which everything will happen will be prices. So in green, these are the extra terms that we have when the government follow a net zero policy, whereby the rates of returns will be impacted negatively by the abatement investment and the emission intensity of carbon price. So if we don't have any net zero policy or environmental policy put in place, the rates of returns are just the marginal productivity of capital. By introducing the environmental policy, the rate of returns will also be impacted by this new investment in abatement and the price of carbon that will be have to pay by the firms to the public authority. So over the transition, as the abatement investment increase and the carbon price go up, we can see that the rate of returns will drop, and so happen to the wages. So both rate of returns and wages will go down, and in a parallel way, the price of energy will go up. So those three prices that we have in the economy would both contribute to find this and increase this distributional impacts that I spoke about in my main results. But just to give you some sort of intuition, how mechanically, because usually we call them some sort of black boxes, but in intuitively, everything goes through these prices in this specific case. Before moving now and showing you some of the results a little bit more in terms of transition dynamics. Let me say maybe one word about our calibration. So most of the macro parameters are standards, and we take them from the literature. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to match specific aggregates, both the labor share and the capital share. Why? Because, as we said, everything will go through those prices, wages, and rates of return. So we want to make sure that we have a good replication with respect to the labor share and capital share of the economy. And finally, from the environmental perspective, we have a high degree of freedom over the parameterization, and we're able to match pretty well all the aggregates of interest, be it the share of emission from energy or non-energy, the global level of carbon, cumulative emissions, temperature, the emission decoupling rate. So now the first result is the carbon price and the macroeconomic dynamics. What I'm showing you over here, this is just the first result to try to also give you some confidence about the framework and the results that we have. So following a carbon price shock, and this is almost follows up naturally from those last equations that I talked about in terms of like the pricing and how they propagate. So if we have one carbon price shock that is positive, what we should expect here is that energy prices goes up, and it takes it about like say 40 periods to go back to steady state. So the steady state here is normalized to 1. So 1 being the steady state of both the energy relative price, energy production, interest rate, and energy wages. And what we see is that energy pricing will be going up following a one-time shock in carbon pricing before going back to steady state. Energy production will go down, the wages will go down, and interest rates will go down. But this is pretty much expected given the shape of the equations that I showed you with respect to the rates of interest and the wages, and also the energy relative price. But is it something we do observe in the data, which is going to be very important? So looking at the California cap and trade market, and this is what I have on the left side on these 4 little figures, this is the parallel. So following a carbon price shock in the California cap and trade market, where we instrument for that using the climate sentiment index, what I'm showing you is the cumulative effect. So the energy price and the cumulative effect have a tendency to go up, while the energy net generation will have a tendency to go down. So do the wages and the equity returns. So the rate of returns in the energy sector for specific firms that we picked in the California market. And this is exactly what we see for a one-time shock in our exercise that using our framework. So our framework is able at least to replicate those stylized facts that we see in the California cap and trade market. So it gives us some sort of confidence in the ability to at least be able to have the same sort of directions. We're not concerned much about the magnitude, but more about the directions of the responses of these key variables that would be driving the whole dynamics moving forward. Now, what really happens then, because what we're thinking about is the distributional impact, so we want to know how would the consumption be impacted by the asset returns, the wages, the non-energy wages, the profits, and the fiscal transfers. And for now, we will drop the fiscal transfers and the government spending, and I will just show you how it's impacted directly by the rates of returns and the wages. So what I have here in black in the first figure on the left is the response of consumption to one-time carbon price shock, an increase, a positive price carbon price shock makes it that consumption drops. So this is the cumulative. So this is the total consumption drop in black, and we decompose that into its drivers. So its main 2 drivers, as we can see, are the one in red and green, which are the wages and the rate of returns. Almost expected, as I argued, those are the 2 main channels, but it's something that gives us a good confidence to see it also in our numerical exercise. Now, if we didn't have any sort of like wealth distribution, there is no heterogeneity in terms of wealth, and we only have 2 types of income, we could almost be tempted to say, well, the difference between the low income and the high income, the drop is not substantially different, so there might not be any sort of distributional impacts. But once we start looking at this wealth distribution, and this is the main part of the heterogeneity, then what we see is that the low income bottom 25% of the wealth distribution are impacted twice as much as the yellow one, which are the high income top 25% of the wealth distribution. So including heterogeneity adds a layer of analysis that we've been missing quite a lot from the literature and speaks quite directly to that political feasibility and the yellow vest crisis that we've witnessed and could be even more substantial moving toward the future. And this is just in a short run, so following one price shock. So how can we think about this in terms of like the medium run and the long run? And this is what we'll be doing here. So we'll construct a laissez-faire scenario where we'll allow emissions to grow by a rate of 2%, which is the growth rate of the economy in this specific case. And we'll have counterfactual, which is the net zero policy. And we'll try to compare both the laissez-faire scenario where we don't have any net zero objective and the net zero policy where we will have a net zero objective. And to just even make it clearer that the heterogeneity is a very important element that we should not overlook. This is the figures this is the welfare of the net zero versus the laissez-faire when we have heterogeneous agents and when we don't have a heterogeneous agents, what we call representative agents, RA climate and heterogeneous climate model. We see that the abatement with different type of abatement costs, and this goes back to the argument I made earlier about the abatement cost function that we borrowed from Nordhaus. Since we have very low confidence over those figures, we take 3 different type scenarios with low abatement, moderate, and high abatement. And what we're showing here is that the welfare over the long run, the welfare improvement over the long run can be overestimated using a representative agent, while underestimated or while there should be slightly lower in the heterogeneous agent perspective, since there will be a presence of a borrowing constraint, which changes the capital holding. So some are borrowers, some are lenders, which is not the case in the representative agent framework. And that changes the whole magnitude of also the welfare impacts of a net zero policy versus the laissez-faire. Now it's still positive and it's still high, but it's slightly lower than the representative agent. What I'm showing you here in these 4 graphs, the first 2 upper ones are the initial. So this first one over here is the one with respect to a low income household, and just under it with respect to a high income household. The idea is just to tell you that whether we're low income or high income, it doesn't change much the story. But what we're interested in is to see how the wealth distribution will move across time. So initially, they start low at the initial point, say today, both low income and high income, whether it's the laissez-faire or the net zero, because that's the starting point, they have exactly the same wealth distribution. We can think about the x-axis as dollars value, and the y-axis, that's the density function. Over the long run, so at the end of the transition, when net zero happens, everything, and we are able to keep all the damages under control, so in 200 years' time, what we have is that the net zero policy in blue, so that's the distribution in blue, is much better. So moves toward the right, while the red laissez-faire distribution is squeezed toward the left, meaning that a net zero policy allows us to generate more wealth at the end of the transition. And this is the first argument that I was making, where we say that it's a welfare enhancing policy. It allows us to accumulate more wealth, and in the mean, everybody is wealthier at the end if we go for a net zero policy today. But as I said, the caveat is what happens in within. And this is probably the slide that I would like to share the most. And I'm just trying to check on the time and would be able to wrap it up right after that. It's what happens during the transition period. So over the transition period, we have our laissez-faire scenario in red, and we have the net zero scenario in blue. And that's the exact same figure that I just showed. So those are the wealth densities for the laissez-faire and the net zero in blue and red. I plot them one against the other. And on the right, what I did, so to make it visually easier to perceive, this is just the difference between those densities, between the red and the blue. So whenever that blue line, this blue line is below 0, it means that we're moving away from the borrowing constraint. In essence, everybody is getting wealthier. But whenever it's above the zero, it means people are starting to crank up toward the borrowing constraint, meaning they're becoming more financially constrained over the transition. So over the first few years, what we observed is that a net zero policy is actually quite interesting, because what it does, it's almost making everybody wealthier. But what's happening in essence is that people perfectly foresee, our households, they perfectly foresee that the government is going for a net zero policy, and they expect that the price of carbon will go up and their wages and rates of returns will go down. So what they start to do is they start to increase their savings to be able to face that drop in wages and rates of returns. But since there is a borrowing constraint and they can't save more than that, what starts to happen very rapidly over the transition is it starts to increase, which means more of the household that were not initially financially constrained starts to now accumulate and move toward the borrowing constraint. And this keep going up until around 45 before starting to fall down over the transition, as now we achieved the sought after net zero policy. And if I push this up to the end, we can see the reverse, which tells us that over the long run, 200 years, we would be, in terms of society and welfare perspectives, we will be gaining. But over the transition, it will have a substantial welfare cost, especially bringing people toward the borrowing constraint. And this is sort of like the message and the animation that allows us to see that sort of timeline, how we move over time. Now, as I said, how can we fix that sort of transition period and allow for the net zero policy to happen without endangering it through the whole political feasibility argument? We could look at transfers. And what I'm showing you here, the first case here is no transfer. This is exactly what I showed earlier when we have one price shock. We're just trying to see whether with one price shock we can have already this sort of like smoothing effects of transfers. So this is the first case where we don't have any transfers. And what I'm showing you after these two graphs are when we have uniform transfers and transfers by income. When we have uniform transfers, we're privileging more the lowest, so the low income, low wealth. So we're giving them a little bit more and basically increasing their consumption following this carbon price environmental policy introduction. But if we would like to almost keep the status quo, and we don't want to get too much into this because the idea is we're not trying to be normative about it, but have just almost like a positive stand. We're just showing the different type of cases and trying to keep the status quo. We see that the transfers by income are the one that is able to smooth the best these negative consumption drops following carbon price shocks. And for the same thing, I wanted to say, by the way, it's the same sort of image that we'll have over the transition. So if I plot exactly the same blue line, having the long run, the medium run transition with fiscal transfers, that blue line would be much lower, and we won't have as many people moving toward the borrowing constraint over the transition. And as I said in the beginning, we have one or two extra cases where we look at the role of learning by doing. And what we show is that having some learning by doing and improvement in innovation allows us to get energy prices much lower. This is all the shaded blue area. And the dark blue line is our baseline case, where we don't have any improvement in innovation. But when we have improvement in innovation through learning by doing, what we do is we lower those carbon prices. And by lowering carbon prices, we're able to increase the wages, both in the energy and non-energy sector, which would help smooth the transition distributional impacts without necessarily requiring those fiscal transfers, or at least using them in the same. And by that, I just want to leave you with the main takeaways, which is exactly the ones that I said in the beginning. So they will be, the carbon pricing will generate some income and wealth distributional impacts. There might be some argument about precautionary savings that would allow us to almost just mechanically feel wealthier in the first few years of the transition. But as soon as the transition hits and the carbon price is really high, we will start experiencing movement toward the borrowing constraint. Income-based approach transfers seems to be the one that smooths the best these distributional impacts. but we should not overlook the role that green innovation could play in also smoothing this distributional impact, and therefore for the investments in green technologies. And something that I haven't talked about today, given the time constraint, is inflationary pressures over the long run, but it's something that we also speak about it in the paper. And with that, I would like to thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Ghassane. Really enjoyed hearing about the paper and these sort of distributional impacts. I think those are sort of first order concerns that we have to consider when we're thinking about climate policy. So at this point, we have some time for Q&A. So anyone who has any questions or comments, you can send them into the Q&A, or we'll try and keep an eye open for hands up. Or so if you want to send in some questions now, Ghassane can answer those. Maybe I will start out, since I'm the moderator, I'll start out with my own question. So one of the things I was interested in is that you talked about how you're calibrating this with the California cap and trade market, and that's sort of a distinguishing feature, which I think is interesting. Have you looked at your framework calibrated on other scenarios like the EU market and other places to see how much these distributional effects depend on the particular calibration?
Oh, you're totally right. We're trying to think about it also in the case of the EU ETS, so for the European Union, and we do have something kind of similar. So the magnitude is not the same, but the movements are the same.
Great. And then I had one other question I wanted to ask you. So, I mean, you talked about how in this net zero transition, right, you're not necessarily matching up with the social cost of carbon. These pathways could be different, and I think that's like a very relevant question to consider, because it's not obvious that we're on the sort of social cost of carbon pathway. So my question is, have you guys, do you have any way of characterizing or had a chance to look at, how far off these pathways are or could be, and maybe perhaps like the magnitude of the sort of welfare impacts that we have by sort of choosing these net zero transition pathways versus the social cost of carbon optimal pathway?
So that's a fantastic question. I think it speaks a lot about like also the big debate, right, on the social cost of carbon and what we really want to do. One thing that we're really looking forward to do is something with respect exactly that you said. So looking at what would be the social cost of carbon in a heterogeneous agent framework. Because the question already in essence is not that easy to answer, since we have to make almost like a normative stand on how to sum the welfare function and so on. But it's something we're definitely looking forward to do, and I think it would be a great comparison with respect to just the cap policy that aims at the carbon neutrality by 2050. My hinge, at least the intuition that I had, that it would probably, the social cost of carbon would not lead to a carbon neutrality by 2050, but it will be much later.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So maybe I'll ask while people are still thinking about their questions. I think I had another question that I wanted to ask you. Oh, yes. So you mentioned, right, your focus here is really about heterogeneity across wealth and different features, but not so much the damage functions at all. I guess I'm wondering, do you have some sort of just speculating how much that sort of damage heterogeneity might matter? I guess my anticipated effect would be those with sort of the lower income tend to be countries or regions that are also have greater exposure to some of these climate risks. So in some sense, you're not ignoring this, but it would only exacerbate sort of the distributional effects. That's my expectation, but I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or insight about that.
Absolutely. I think this is also almost like the way we're trying to think about it and pitch it, is that the sort of the results that we get is almost like a lower bound, and including climate damages, especially exactly as you said, because then the lower income countries would be probably the most impacted by such events, then it will only exacerbate this sort of like distributional impact. So in this specific case, we didn't include climate damages, but I think it's a good avenue of probably extension.
Awesome. Does anyone, any questions? I'm looking to see here on the Q&A, or if anyone wants to sort of raise their hand, let us know. I have one more question as well. Maybe I can ask this one right now. So just as a follow-up, you mentioned that, like, so you get sort of, I think importantly, sort of these minimal differences in income inequality, but pretty noticeable and substantial effects on the wealth inequality. And you can show in the model, right, that you're able to resolve this to some degree through these transfers. Is this policy something that's on the table with policymakers? Is this something that's been discussed? I mean, this to me, I mean, clearly has become more and more important as we think in macroeconomics and have talked about these sort of heterogeneities and inequalities. I'm just wondering if this has at all been discussed or sort of on the table, or how far are we in the policy discussion from these types of tools being incorporated in the policies that people have put forward?
I think within a country, it's probably something that one could try to achieve, although it's probably very heated debate that might go through parliaments or whichever way we do it in different countries. But I think the one that would be more difficult, it's related to your previous question, is how can we do it when we're talking about a global scale, especially if we're speaking about in transfers between countries. That might be very, very difficult to achieve. And that's why I think probably one of the avenues through which we can achieve net zero at a lower cost is maybe through innovation in green technologies. So maybe within countries, it's feasible to use these fiscal transfers, but across countries, that might become much harder to put in place.
Interesting. Okay, cool. Well, we are about out of time. I want to thank again Ghassane for his presentation and his insight on the distributional effects. Again, I think this is sort of the types of policy questions that matter. We're thinking about potentially suboptimal scenarios and how to deal with those the best we can. So thank you very much. I want to again thank all of our attendees for coming and being a part of our webinar today. We'll have more on the chat. We've put down the information so that you can join in and register to receive updates and be a part of future events. The plan for us is to continue to do this about once a month for our Young Scholar webinar, and we'll be sending out notices and information about that. And then there's also the different e-access events that have all been fantastic, and we hope you can join us with. So thank you very much, Ghassane, and for everyone who participated, and we'll end the webinar with that.
Thanks a lot, Mike.
Yep.
It was a pleasure. Thanks.